I did everything for her. I built our life from scratch, invested every ruble, every moment, every aspiration. And she? She betrayed me in the dirtiest and most humiliating way. I looked at her and didn't understand how it could have gone so far. When you keep a woman on a pedestal, buy her the finest jewelry, give her the world, and she kisses another man in return, what is there left to do? The perfect way is to squeeze every last penny out of her, every last groan of despair, and throw her out on the street like a toy she doesn't need.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
Tell me, what would you do for a woman who took over your life? You'd give her everything you have, right? Maybe even more than you had. That's exactly what I did. I gave her my time, my money, my heart, every penny of it. Every day I woke up thinking how to make her happy, how to give her life meaning, because in my mind, Alina's happiness was synonymous with my happiness. How wrong I was. It all started with one smile. You know, the one that captivates you at first sight. Her lips curved as if she knew more about my weaknesses than I did. And in that moment, I realized I'd fallen into a trap, though of course I didn't realize it right away. She looked like a dream, slim, graceful, with flawless skin and golden hair that seemed to shimmer in the setting sun. That evening, all I could think about was how to approach her, how to win her over. We met at a fancy restaurant where I held meetings with business partners. Alina was standing at the bar, ordering a cocktail, and watched with a slight smile, as if all this was her stage and we were her audience. She knew how to get attention. I couldn't look away. All my thoughts seemed frozen in one moment. It was that moment when you realize there's only more to come. More investment, more expectation, and as it turned out later, more pain. I walked up to her, not knowing what to say. I just greeted her, as nonchalantly as possible, though a storm of emotion raged inside me. She looked up at me, her gaze full of confidence. I wasn't even surprised at how quickly she agreed to have dinner with me. From that night on, my addiction began. Yeah, addiction is the right word. You can't control yourself when you're around a woman like her. Her presence was hypnotizing, and I didn't notice how day by day I was becoming a hostage to my own feelings. At first it was like a fairy tale. We spent evenings in restaurants, she told me about her dreams, and I saw myself as the one who would help her realize them. We traveled to the best resorts, spent money on expensive gifts. I wanted her to feel like a queen. And she was indeed a queen in my eyes, radiant, unattainable. I did everything I could to make her comfortable. I worked hard, I made deals, I took risks, but also that she wouldn't need anything. I thought I was buying her love, but in reality it was the opposite. I was paying for my own illusion. She was never interested in how I made my money, how many hours I spent at work. She didn't care. All that mattered to her was that the money always came. She was used to it. At first she was shy, even seemed grateful for everything I did for her. But then her demands became more and more demanding. One day she told me she wanted to buy a car, and a month later she told me she wanted an apartment closer to the center. I didn't object. Her wishes were law to me. But the more I gave, the more I felt empty. Have you ever noticed that in a relationship with a woman you love, it sometimes feels like you're only giving and getting nothing in return? At some point, I realized that was the case. I tried to console myself with the thought that it was just her manner, that she would show her love differently, but time passed and nothing changed. One day I came home earlier than usual to surprise her. We had just returned from a trip to Italy, and I was thrilled with the time we had spent. I bought her jewelry and wanted to see her smile when she saw the gift I had prepared. But as I entered the house, I felt something strange, a strange tension in the air. The house was too quiet, even though she usually left the TV on or music playing. I called her name, but there was no response. Then I went to the bedroom and froze on the threshold. She was in bed with another man. You will never forget that moment when your heart clenches with pain and disappointment. My body felt paralyzed. All my senses and emotions froze. She didn't even try to hide her betrayal. She just looked at me with the same expression on her face, as if I was just a passing visitor in her life who had suddenly returned sooner than expected. "It's not what you think," she began, but I already knew that was the end of it. I stood in the doorway and looked at her. My wife. My love. The woman I had supported, pampered, loved with all my heart. And here she was, naked in my bed with a strange man, her breathing still rapid after what they'd done. I felt everything in me freeze. There was no pain, no rage. Just emptiness. It's not what you think, her voice shook, but I saw in her eyes not so much remorse as fear of losing everything I'd given her. Not what I think. I grinned, feeling the ability to speak slowly return. Then explain to me what it is. Explain what a man is doing in my bed, with my wife, in my house. She couldn't answer. Just sat there, clutching the sheet as if that could save her from me, from the truth, from what was inevitable. I knew everything had changed. Everything up until that moment seemed like an illusion. I looked at her with only one thought in my mind. You played love like chess, and now I am your opponent that you underestimated. Her lover rose from the bed, nervously gathering his clothes. He looked lost, like a schoolboy caught doing something forbidden. I paid him no attention. He was just a tool she was using to break me. He was nothing. All my rage was directed at her, the one I considered my woman. Get out, I told him. My words sounded calm, even too calm. In that moment, I realized I was no longer in control of my emotions. It was like watching myself from the outside. He cast a quick glance at Alice, as if he was waiting for some kind of encouragement or permission to leave. But she sat silent, not uttering a word. Get out now before I change my mind, I repeated, and this time he stormed out of the room as if he were being chased by demons. However, to him, I may have been that demon. Alice tried to speak as soon as the door slammed shut behind him. You have to understand. I didn't mean for this to happen. Her voice was full of fake remorse, and in that moment I was disgusted by everything she represented. It was too easy for her to play the victim. She was playing the role of a weak, helpless woman who didn't want all of this. But I knew the truth. Didn't want to? I squinted, slowly walking closer to the bed. You didn't want to? You think you can betray me and then say it was unintentional? She turned away, hiding her face behind her hands. It was a mask, another ruse. Her tears didn't bother me. I was no longer the type of person to believe in these scenes. Over the years of our relationship, I'd learned her too well, her every weakness, her every trick. And I finally realized that she'd been using them against me all along. You knew what you were getting into. You thought I was too blind to notice what was going on. You thought I'd turn a blind eye to all of this while you enjoyed life on my money. But you know what? I leaned closer and our faces were only a few centimeters apart. It's over. She shrank back, as if the words made her heart seize with coldness. I could see her shivering, but it no longer moved me. Her time was up. I was no longer her savior. I was her judge. And the verdict was already in. You think you can fool me so easily and walk away without consequences? You think you can go on living the way you used to? My voice was icy. I've given you everything. But now I'm going to take everything away from you. You will no longer be queen, Alice. From now on, you're a nobody. She looked at me with the same horror I'd once only seen in movies. She never thought I was capable of such a thing. She had always been fine with me being soft and submissive, a man who did everything for her happiness without asking for anything in return. But now she saw a different side. And that side was unfamiliar to her, frighteningly cold and calculating. What do you want to do? She whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. Her defenselessness in that moment was feigned, I knew it. She was an accomplished actress, but I wasn't going to believe her now. All her masks, all her tricks crumbled before me like a house of cards. What do I want to do? I asked again, as if pondering her question. I want to make you feel the pain I felt when I realized you betrayed me. I want you to face your fears like I'm facing mine right now. Did you think you could just live your life playing on my feelings? Now I'm going to show you what it's like to be left with nothing. Her lips quivered. She seemed to realize I wasn't kidding. There was fear in her eyes, real fear, not the kind she showed in moments of petty arguments when she wanted to make me feel guilty. No, it was fear of the unknown. She was used to safety, to my money, to me being her protector. But now it was all over. You can't just take me out. It's illegal. A note of panic rose in her voice. She realized she was losing control, that her previous methods were no longer working. We're married. I have rights. I grinned. Her confidence that she could stay afloat even as her world crumbled was almost touching. Almost. But I knew how the system worked, I knew what loopholes there were in the laws, and I'd already prepared a plan. "Oh honey, you have no idea what I'm capable of," I said with cold-blooded confidence. "You think the law can save you? That's funny. I fed you, clothed you, bought you everything you wanted, and now you dare talk to me about rights? You have nothing anymore. No money, no house, no status. You're nothing." Her eyes widened with horror. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. This moment was sweet revenge for me. I savored every moment, every frightened sigh she took, every desperate look she gave me as she searched for salvation where there was none. She was used to living in the world I had created for her, and now that world was shattered. "You don't realize what you're doing," she finally said, her voice shaking like a small child lost in the woods. She began to realize the magnitude of the disaster that was bearing down on her. But it was too late. "I'll be lost without you." Those words should have evoked pity, but nothing happened. The pity left along with her betrayal. "That's not my problem, Alice," I replied coldly. "You're on your own now." I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving her sitting on the bed in despair. But before I left, I looked over my shoulder and spoke the last words I knew she'd remember forever. "You thought you were playing me. But I was the one holding the cards. Now your game is over." I left the room, leaving her frozen on the bed, stunned by my words. As I closed the door behind me, I felt something strange relief. That emptiness that had settled in me since the moment I'd seen her with another man was beginning to be filled with something new. A realization of power. I was no longer her puppet. I'd broken free of the chains I'd put on myself, and now I held her life in my hands. Every step down the hallway to the exit echoed in my head. I felt like a man about to leave an old, decrepit prison and enter a new world where there were no boundaries. I knew it was going to get harder from here, but there was no turning back anymore. When I got into the car, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. I knew I had taken the first step, but the journey was just beginning. My revenge must be complete. Take away not only her money and status, but the most important thing, the sense of security she'd always taken for granted. I started simple. The first thing I did was block her access to our joint accounts. I was the only one who could control the finances, and that was my first weapon against her. She was used to living large, ordering expensive things, traveling the world without doing anything. And so, in an instant, I made her a pauper. As I completed all the necessary banking transactions, a feeling of almost sadistic satisfaction arose in my mind. I could see how it would happen. She would go to the ATM, try to withdraw money, and it would be empty. She would call me, as she always did, expecting me to solve her problem. But this time her calls will go unanswered. This time her life would crumble right under her feet. But that was just the beginning. I couldn't just kick her out of the apartment. I needed to make her really feel what it was like to be left with nothing. I went to a lawyer to strip her of all rights to our joint property. Sure, she could have tried to fight for her share, but she didn't know that I had prepared in advance. All real estate and assets were titled in my name. Everything she thought was hers actually belonged to me. She thought she knew me. She thought I would always be the man who put up with her whims and turned a blind eye to her faults. But she was wrong. I became someone else, someone she underestimated. And now she would reap the rewards of her arrogance. When I got home that evening, she was already waiting for me. Her face was contorted with anxiety, her eyes red with tears. She was trying to maintain control, but I could see her world was crumbling. "Did you block my cards?" she asked, her voice full of panic. "Yes," I answered coldly, taking off my coat and not looking at her. To me, this was just another step towards completing my mission. "You can't do this to me." She rushed toward me, her hands shaking as she grabbed my shoulder. "We're married. I'm entitled to that money." I looked at her like she was nothing. "No, you have no right. It's all my money. You've been living off me. But that's over. Now you're going to have to learn to survive on your own." Her face froze in a mask of despair. She stood in front of me, trying to figure out what was going on. It was finally dawning on her that her old life was over. All her privileges, her carefree attitude, it was all gone, and she couldn't get it back. I savored the scene, watching her confidence crumble like sand through my fingers with each passing second. "You think you can just ruin everything like that?" Her voice shook, she began to choke on her own emotions. "You're not like that. I mean, you loved me. We We lived together for so many years. You can't just take me out of your life. I'm not cutting you out, I glared at her coldly. You crossed yourself off the moment you decided I could be a backup when you betrayed me with someone else. She tried to object to something, but I interrupted her. You thought love meant tolerating? That if I loved you, I would turn a blind eye to your cheating? Well, now you're going to find out what the real consequences are. Her lips quivered. She was no longer trying to play the strong, confident woman. All that was left of her was a broken, frightened figure who no longer knew what to do. She finally realized that she had lost control. But once I saw that fear had finally taken hold of her, I decided to strike next. Tomorrow is your last day to pack your things, I said quietly, like it was something I took for granted. I've filed divorce papers. I want you out of this apartment by tonight. What? You can't. There was real panic in her voice. This is my apartment too. We lived here together. No, I smiled, feeling the adrenaline start to pound in my temples again. This apartment has always belonged to me. You're just a temporary guest, Alice. You're only here because I let you be here. Her eyes widened. She hadn't expected this turn of events. She'd always thought she owned half of what we had, but the truth was much harsher. I'd specifically made sure that all the real estate documents, accounts, and property were recorded in my name only. She was never interested in that, because she thought she could control me. But now she was faced with a reality that was much harsher than her fantasies. You can't kick me out, she whispered, as if she wasn't addressing me, but herself, trying to convince herself that none of this was true. Where am I going to go? I didn't answer. At this point, I wasn't interested in what she was going to do next. Let her figure out for herself how to live her life now. She always thought she knew how to control people, how to manipulate situations in her favor. Now she has a chance to find out what it's like to live without my money, without my protection. When I walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, her world began to crumble at an alarming rate. At first she still hoped it was some kind of nightmare, that I was just kidding or temporarily lost my head. But it was much worse than that. The realization that she was no longer in control of the situation hit her with a wave of panic. Alice walked around the apartment as if in a fog. Every corner, everything reminded her of those times when she could easily order any luxury, when money flowed, and I was there to fulfill her every whim. But now these walls were no longer her home. This place had become alien, hostile. She no longer felt safe here. How could I let this happen? Her thoughts were racing haphazardly. Just yesterday, she had been confident that she was in control. She was the one who decided how and when to play her game. But that's all changed now. Her world, built on manipulation and lies, began to crumble with such speed that she didn't even have time to realize how it all happened. She sat down on the couch, wrapping her arms around her head. Her heart was pounding, her chest constricting with fear. She'd always thought she was smart, capable of turning any situation to her advantage. But now her confidence in her own invulnerability was gone. She faced a truth she was afraid to admit: she had no control over anything. What will I do? She thought, and her fear became almost physical. She had never worked, never built a career. Always been sure that her attractiveness and ability to manipulate people would be her pass to a trouble-free life. But now it wasn't working anymore. Her beauty, her charm, it was all useless in the face of someone who was determined to take everything from her. Alice began to realize that she had nowhere to go. Her family had long ago turned their backs on her because of her arrogance. The friends that surrounded her at expensive parties would disappear just as quickly once she lost her money. She couldn't afford their lavish lifestyles without my financial contribution. All those she thought were close to her were really just a part of this illusory world she had created around her. I'm alone, she whispered, and the words sounded like a sentence. Her lips quivered, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. It wasn't just fear, it was the realization that she had ruined her own life. She thought she was playing me, that she'd always have an escape route. But she was wrong. Now there was no way out. The realization tore at her from the inside out. She felt like a little girl lost in a big, cruel world. A world that no longer obeyed her rules. A world where she was nothing. She was still trying to find a solution, some way out, but every step she considered led her back to the same question: where would she go? She stood up and walked over to the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was no longer any confidence in that face. The face of a woman used to being strong, always finding a way out, now reflected only fear and despair. She knew she had lost everything that was important to her. And worst of all, it was her own fault. The next morning, Alice woke up feeling as if her body was filled with lead. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to collect her thoughts. Sleep did not bring relief. On the contrary, it only exacerbated her sense of helplessness. Against the backdrop of a reality that continued to crumble, her own fears and doubts became more and more real. She stood up, but her legs were shaking. With each step toward the kitchen, she felt her body abandoning more and more of its usual comfort. The sounds of the apartment, once cozy and full of life, now seemed empty and ominous to her. Every detail reminded her that her life would never be the same again. There was no breakfast. The kitchen cabinets were empty. Alice remembered that her last money had been used to buy expensive outfits and cosmetics that now seemed useless to her. Before, she could just order food, but now she had to face the reality of having to do something herself. She decided to go to the store, but the steps to the door were agonizing. Every action seemed like a huge task for her. When she stepped outside, her world was different. The noise of the city that used to be the background to her comfort now sounded like an unpredictable threat. People passed by, and in every glance, in every gesture, she saw a reflection of her own vulnerability. At the supermarket, Alice realized that the money she could spend on expensive groceries and treats now no longer existed. Her bank cards were blocked and the cash in her wallet wasn't enough to even buy basic groceries. It was like a punch in the face. She, who was used to having her wishes fulfilled without delay, was now forced to face acute shortages. After a few minutes of agonizing deliberation, she decided to buy the essentials: bread, milk, eggs. The set of products turned out to be very modest, and she felt that her former life seemed to her a distant myth. As soon as she left the store with the bag in her hands, her gaze fell on the windows of expensive boutiques and restaurants. That luxurious world she had once floated in now seemed unattainable to her. Returning home was even more difficult. Alice, tired, with a bag in her hands, went up to the floor and entered the apartment that was no longer her home. Every detail, every object in the interior now reminded her that her life had become a nightmare. The feeling of being surrounded by a foreign and hostile environment became unbearable. Trying to find some solace, she decided to take up cleaning. But each step, each cleaning only deepened her sense that her life was ruined. She didn't know how to cope with the fact that her old world had been torn apart and she was alone, with no support and no idea how to go on. Every night she went to bed hoping for a miracle, but each time she woke up with the same sense of dread and helplessness. The shadows of the past that had once seemed harmless to her now tormented her like demons. In the moments of nightly rest, when the silence became too loud, she began to realize the depth of her tragedy. Alice continued to look for work, but her lack of experience and lack of connections in her new reality put insurmountable obstacles in front of her. Every rejection from potential employers was like a knife in her heart. She tried several times, but each time she returned home, devastated and depressed, realizing that her life no longer belonged to her. When I left Alice in that apartment, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was finally able to rid myself of the constant pressure of her presence and manipulation. In the morning when I woke up, one thing was clear: I had started a new chapter of my life. I decided to focus on my new freedom, on exactly how I was going to manage the situation to see my plan through. First, I conceived of a few things I needed to do. My plan wasn't just to leave Alice with nothing, but to show her that her life and all of her illusions really depended on my decision. It was important to make her realize how much I could change her world. I started each morning by watching the news and business reports, watching my investments grow, watching my assets increase. I savored every moment of seeing my life improve while her life was being destroyed. I realized that in reality, all of this was not only revenge, but a lesson for her, a lesson she would probably never forget. That afternoon, as Alice walked out of the store with a bag of cheap groceries, I watched her from a distance. I could see her struggling to carry the bags and her face contorted with fatigue. She looked like she couldn't believe it was her life right now. I saw the way she acted, and it was like a sweet revenge I was looking forward to. Every night I would come home and see the apartment where we used to live empty. I personally made sure her things were packed up and sent to the storage unit I had rented specifically for that purpose. I wanted her to realize that she no longer had anything that connected her to her past life. Everything she had no longer existed. I was careful with every step I took. My attorney informed me that Alice had filed a complaint with the court, but I was prepared for that. My plan was carefully thought out and all legal issues were taken into consideration. I made sure all the paperwork was in order, that all rights to the property were fully mine. I didn't leave her any chance. Alice seemed to be trying to rebuild her life. I knew she was looking for work, that she was seeking help, but I didn't care. I was happy to see her efforts doomed to failure. She was in a difficult situation, and I wanted her to feel every minute of that humiliation. When I saw her on the street, where she was trying to cope with her new reality, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. I realized that she was utterly desperate. Her attempts to find a job, her failures were all part of the plan I had devised. I wanted her to know that her old life was not just lost, but in ruins. Every time I received her texts and calls, I didn't respond. I wanted her to feel complete isolation, to make her realize that there was no one else to support her. I knew it would make her suffering even deeper, but that was part of what I had to do. My goal was not only to get revenge, but to show her that everything she thought was hers could be taken away in an instant. When I looked at the results of my revenge, I felt I had accomplished what I wanted. Alice, believing she was in control, was now utterly desperate. I watched her attempts to survive, and each new defeat was a real pleasure to me. I watched her slowly lose all of her privileges and affections that she once considered an integral part of her life. As the morning wore on, I continued to watch her struggle to cope with her new reality. Seeing her agonize over job rejections and her world crumbling, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Everything I had planned had come to fruition with a precision that was to my liking. I saw her struggling to find a job and how her attempts were doomed to failure due to her lack of skills and experience. Every night when I returned home, I watched my apartment, from which I had kicked her out, turn more and more into a symbol of her lost world. I purposely ignored her calls and texts, ignored her attempts to contact me. I wanted her to feel completely alone and isolated. And it worked. Every message she sent for help, every failed effort she made reminded me that I had done the right thing. At one point, I thought I could make her suffering even more acute. I began to contemplate using my connections to create more obstacles in her life. But then I realized that was overkill. I was satisfied with what I had already done. I'm happy with the way things are unfolding. Alice was in a position where she was having a hard time dealing with any challenges, and that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't feel regret. On the contrary, I felt proud that I was able to realize my plan to the end. I watched her life turn into an endless series of problems and obstacles. My revenge had achieved its goal, and I was completely satisfied that I had been able to show her that her world was illusory, that her confidence in her integrity was a deception. At the same time, I realized that perhaps my revenge had been even more brutal than I had originally planned. But I didn't care. I looked at her life with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that I had done everything I could. I didn't regret going to extremes to show her how vulnerable she was. In the end, I decided that my revenge was complete. Alice had learned the lesson I wanted to teach her. And while I could continue to intensify her suffering, I was sure she had already gotten enough. I felt I had accomplished everything I wanted and could now enjoy seeing her life destroyed and unable to be restored.